But she was the best boss I've ever had. She was extremely thoughtful to the people, for the people who worked around her. You know, in politics, most people kiss up and kick down. But in Downing Street, she kissed down and kicked up. The people who made the tea, the people who brought in the food, the people who opened the doors, her beloved detectives, they could do no wrong. Whereas the senior civil servants and ministers, they must have felt sometimes they could do no right. Because her view was that they were at the top, they had to perform well for the British taxpayer, and she was going to make sure that they did so. There was one occasion, and sometimes I think she was a bit too harsh. There was one occasion in which she was meeting for the first time her new scientific advisor. She subjected him to the usual tough cross-examination, and as his body was being carried into the room, she turned to me and said, "Why do people take everything I say so seriously?" On the other hand, and this is a story which some of you may know, when the Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, was lunching at Chequers, the waitress who was serving accidentally tripped and poured soup into his lap, at which point Lady Thatcher jumped up and comforted the waitress. As I say, it was a great privilege working for her. And I think that one of the things we probably all agree tonight, I don't need to address it much, is the idea that the important role that women have played, are playing, and must in future play in Republican politics and in Conservative politics in England. Let me put it this way. Until very recently, women were the backbone of support for both parties of the right in both countries. It's only in recent times that this has come to seem different. I'm married to someone who was the vice president of the Alabama Women's Republican Federation. And I'll tell her that. And she went up to work, you know, in Ohio during the election and knocking door to door and things like that. And she said to me, "I don't believe the current democratic appeal to women in the long run is going to work. What people want, what women want from their own politicians and from others, is they want a good range of policies that will enable them to live good lives, to create decent things, to help their families, and to make sure their children get a better life. We are," she said, "more than the talking vaginas that the Democrats assume us to be." And I think that is correct, and that future politics will make that point. Now, I want to, there's one other thing I wanted to say here. I'm sorry, Charles, Jennifer, yes. Oh yes, I would be terribly remiss if I hadn't mentioned Senator Ayotte. I mean, you don't need me to tell you this, you know it, but I'm going to say it all the same, and that is that she has made an extraordinarily strong impact on Washington, particularly on defense and foreign policy and national security, in a very short time. She has become a leader in the Senate on these issues, and I know you must be very proud. Now, I regret one thing, and I'm sure this doesn't apply to anybody here. But although my opinions are rock-ribbed, an awful lot of Republicans these days, with far better claim to the title, seem to have ribs made of more pliable and unreliable substance. Now, some in this state, I think, may have been discouraged by the changing nature of New Hampshire politics. These changes result in part from the emigration of refugees from Massachusetts, who, rebelling against the high tax, high spending practices of their state, flee over the border in order to vote for the same policies that provoked them to flee in the first place. Maybe they take too literally the two words of your state motto, live free. If so, I want to recommend that you think about a retort. Maybe you should invent your own local variant of the bumper sticker invented by Oregon conservatives who were perturbed by the arrival of similar refugees from California. It reads, "Don't Californigate Oregon." But the hard fact is that political parties have to deal with the voters they have, whether they arrive in New Hampshire as babies or as immigrants. One of Lincoln's achievements, and of course we're celebrating Lincoln tonight, was to ensure that America remained one nation. Even today, not everyone realizes this. When I arrived at Logan Airport this morning, I picked up a frantic email from my wife. She wrote, "John, you left your green card behind. Will you be able to get back into the country?" I reassured her that I would, at least I think it was a reassurance. That said, the main purpose tonight for me is to argue that Republicans in New Hampshire and everywhere else will be foolish if they discard the prudent and realistic conservatism that has been the basis of every successful Republican administration from Lincoln to Ronald Reagan. And not only foolish in terms of policy, but also, even more so, foolish in terms of winning votes and winning elections. Before I get to that central argument, though, I'd like to say a little bit about Lincoln and New Hampshire Republicanism. Lincoln did not come from this state or this region, but his life and opinions reflect the granite qualities and prudent attitudes of the people here. He was a frontiersman who educated himself, worked hard to become a lawyer, put his legal and political skills at the service of other frontiersmen, entered politics in the great cause of anti-slavery, and became one of the greatest presidents in America's history. Clare Boothe Luce once said that all great men could be summed up in a single phrase. She suggested for Lincoln the phrase, "Lincoln freed the slaves." That he certainly did. But that phrase does not quite do him justice. He freed the slaves while saving the Union. Both of those causes were critical to his heart and crucial to his politics. And somewhat to my surprise, both those causes are well represented in the film Lincoln that recently helped Daniel Day-Lewis to his third Oscar. Let me have a brief aside here. Margaret Thatcher, citing Clare Boothe Luce with approval, famously described Ronald Reagan as the man who won the Cold War without firing a shot. And you will notice that this phrase, as with my emendation of Mrs. Luce, is a sentence composed of two phrases, each as important as the other. He won the Cold War, and he did so without firing a shot. And that is the measure of the greatness of that man. End of aside. Now, why was I pleasantly surprised by the picture of Lincoln presented in the movie? Well, I've read and seen other works by the scriptwriter Tony Kushner, who is a devout left-winger, and I expected a different view of Lincoln and of the politics of his time, one in which the hero would be not the president, but the passionate abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens, Lincoln being too cool and cerebral. Lincoln experts tell me that there were a very few questionable things, mistakes and shots at conservatives in the movie, but it was on the whole a favorable but realistic picture of President Lincoln, of how he maneuvered deftly and not wholly scrupulously to get Congress to pass the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery before the war's end. And it showed Thaddeus Stevens eventually adopting Lincoln's shrewd tactics to obtain the idealistic goal at which they both aimed. What the film shows to us is that if you want to achieve great things and to entrench them permanently, then you have to persuade a great many doubters to join you in achieving them. But you have to do this, you have to have a clear vision of what you want to achieve, which becomes a clear political direction for others to follow. The two greatest conservative leaders of our time, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, both had that clear political direction.
GrokTV.